here on July 28th, 2006. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Ed Bruin, and this is my wife Paula.
Okay, great. And so we're sitting in Pacific Heights house.
Cow Hollow.
Yeah, Cow Hollow. And your daughter's upstairs with her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And you're enjoying the day so far. And I just came here to ask, a little bit about your childhood and what it was like for you growing up. Where'd you grow up? That kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd be happy to tell you. I was born and raised in Chicago, on the southwest side of Chicago, and to a Irish family. All my ancestors came from Ireland, and I was the oldest boy and the third child out of 7 children. So I ended up with 3 sisters and 3 brothers. And so we were raised on the south side of Chicago. And I guess, I almost should start by telling you the biggest factor in our being raised was my father was an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. And so we were very poor because he was changing jobs often. And so everybody was poor back in those days, but the neighborhoods were, these weren't wealthy neighborhoods, but we were poorer than the majority of them. And so that's a big factor in my growing up. I went to a Catholic grammar school and a Catholic high school, and well, that's the way we lived. I guess I should tell you some stories about being poor. About what?
We were at Cafe Cucini this morning, which we love to do, and we were laughing about the chicken story in his childhood.
Oh yeah, my father. We generally, I don't know how we bought chickens when we were kids, but I think they were dead. I didn't think they had a hair, but I remember plucking chickens, so they must have feathers but no head. But this one time my father brought home a chicken, and he went downstairs into the basement and was with a hatchet cutting off the chicken's head. Well, he was so traumatized by this because he kept hitting and hitting, and the things weren't giving and all this, that by the time he got through, he threw the chicken into a wash tub, and he had to go up and take a nap or maybe have a drink. I'm not sure, but he was traumatized by it. And it was even worse when he finally got up and he went down to get the chicken, and he looked in the tub and it wasn't there. Apparently the chicken had somehow got out of the tub and ran around without a head on. But it was kind of a funny event in our family. I was also telling my wife about the fact we were, it gets very cold in Chicago in the winter time, and sometimes we wouldn't have any money for any coal. We had a coal burning furnace. And I remember sometimes, like one time my mother had me get my wagon and put a bushel basket in the wagon and go over. We lived just less than a block from a railroad track, and if you go down there, they used to unload coal down there, and there was a lot of coal that got missed to trucks and stuff like that to fill up the basket with coal, and it wasn't easy. You didn't get a lot of coal, so. But it was very embarrassing for me to be strolling down the street pulling my wagon with the coal. But I was telling Paula this morning about a funny thing that happened. I don't remember all the details of this, but apparently we were, what you had in the basement, you had what they called a coal bin. And there was a window to it, and they would deliver the coal through that window, carrying it from the street in the leather bags and dump it in. We never had anyone carry it. It was dumped in front. We had to shovel it in. But apparently, this one winter, we were out of coal, and my father started burning chopping up and burning the coal bin. And so the funny thing was when the landlord came over the next summer and went downstairs, the coal bin was gone. There was not only no coal, but no coal bin either. So anyhow, that was
He
kind
said,
of
where in the hell is the coal bin?
But
So what did you learn about that, about being poor? You had mentioned a couple times.
well, gee, I guess you can survive it. I don't know what I learned about it. Again, you can survive these things, and I did. And I ended up where I got both my brother and I got a scholarship to the Catholic high school, so a need scholarship, and so we both did that. But we ended up where, well, let me tell you a little bit about my father. I told you he was an alcoholic, and he had a hard time keeping jobs, and that was ever from the time practically when he was first married. You know, I mean, I remember he was my grandfather was a streetcar man, my dad's father. He was a motorman on the old streetcars in Chicago. And my dad's older brother went on to the streetcars, and then my dad went on to the streetcars. So the whole male in the Bruin family were all working on the streetcars. And I was the oldest boy, and I had this strong, as a little toddler, strong attraction to my father, you know. And he was working the split shift where he'd go in early in the morning and work the commute, and then he'd have some few hours off, and then he'd go in later in the afternoon for the commute rush. And my mother tells me I was asleep when he went into work, but I used to get up later on, and then he'd come home from work, and I hadn't been up very long, but I'd go back to bed with him. And so we had this wonderful relationship. And one of the difficult things is when you have that kind of relationship and you see your father doing things that he's not supposed to be doing. I mean, like not providing for the family, and stuff like that. And the hardships that families have to go through because of this, it's, you know, you're kind of torn, and it's still, I had this, and so he just basically wasn't very much there for us. And but I remember that loyalty thing. One day he picked me up. I was walking back to school, I think, and he picked me up in the car. And again, like I say, he's like not being there for us. And he said, "Well, how are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm fine, except I've got a toothache." And he said, well, with that, he reached in his back pocket and he pulled out a half pint of whiskey, and he gave me a sweet. Of course, it tastes terrible.
How old were you?
I was 11 maybe, or something like that. And he said, "Now don't tell your mother that I did this." And boy, that was like a bond. That because I wasn't with them very much, and we kind of bonded together, and they would have had to torture me to get me to tell anyone about him doing that. You know, that kind of loyalty you feel for him. But still, it's bad when you see him not taking care of the family, and eventually, you know, it just didn't. Well, it was a bad situation. So.
And what about your mom?
My mother was like a saint in the place. I mean, she was trying to make, despite all these hardships, she was trying to make it all work. And I remember, and having 7 kids wasn't too good. She says she never cared for sex very much after a while, because my dad could roll over and go to sleep, and she'd lay there and wonder, is she going to get pregnant again? You know, and so it was difficult for her. She was trying to make do the best she could. And again, my dad was absent a lot, so we saw a lot of her. Oh, there's another thing. You remember things that about my dad. you sometimes remember things you're proud of. I remember when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my brother and I were playing Indians. And back then you didn't go to the store and buy a bow and arrow. You had a twig and you bent the twig and tied a string across it, and then you got a smaller twig and you tried to shoot the arrow. And we were sneaking up on this young man that was working on his car down in the corner. And we were sneaking up like we were Indians and shooting the arrows at him. And of course they never went that far enough, but he could hear us, and all that. So one time he jumped up and he acted like he was going to go after us. And we ran like hell, into the house, and my dad was there. And I'm not sure whether he was having a beer or not. He was sitting at the kitchen table, but anyhow, he was going to go out and show that guy that can't hurt his kids. So the reason I remember that is I was proud of him. My dad was out. Boy, he was going to show that guy, and it's one of the stories you remember even though you were only 7 years old, perhaps.
Thank you. So you were born in the south side of Chicago, and then where did you go to school?
Well, I went to local schools,
Right.
and as I said, I went to Catholic grammar school,
Right.
and then to high school. And what we used to do, in Chicago, you didn't go downtown. We didn't go downtown. We didn't. When we were growing up, we lived in a little area, and they were. I'm out of wind, running up the stairs.
Take your time.
They were single-family residences, and they were mostly Irish. And although we had good friends that weren't Irish, but most of the people in the neighborhood were Irish. And so I used to take the streetcar to school, to high school, and I walked to the grammar school. And while in high school, I enjoyed high school, but I wasn't a good student. And I didn't enjoy the studies. I enjoyed the guys. I went to an all-boys high school, so I never gave any thought to going to college. No one talked about it. We just assumed I would not. And I'll tell you about a little trauma in our family. We were, at one time, my father was in the hospital, and we were going to be evicted because we weren't paying the rent. And this was when I was a junior in high school. And every day we knew we were going to be evicted, but we didn't know just when. So every day I'd come home from high school and I'd walk down the street and I'd get to this corner and our corner, and I'd look around and we weren't out in the street, and I'd breathe a sigh of relief. But then one day I came home and there we were out in the street. So at that time, my mother's sister's husband, who was a big politician in Chicago, was a little embarrassed by his sister-in-law and her family being out in the street. So he made arrangements for the family to move down to this little town 70 miles south of Chicago. Well, there I was, a junior in high school, and I certainly didn't want to move down to some little town. So I stayed with friends for the remainder of my junior year and my senior year in high school. And then after graduating, I went down to this little town, but just for the summer. And then a friend found me a job in Chicago, and I moved back up, and I stayed with my sister for a while and stayed with friends and stuff like that, all until I went into the Army. I worked downtown in Chicago for a couple years then, until I was drafted, and I went into the Army. And I didn't have any real concern about going in the Army, but I thought, all of the things being equal, I'd rather be here. And so, but anyhow, I got drafted and I went into the Army. And after or during basic training, uh, I took a series of tests and stuff like that. So they asked me if I wanted to go to the Officers Candidate School. Well, this was in the early 50s, and I thought, the way the world was, I'm liable to be in the Army the rest of my life, for all I know, with Russia and all this. So I said, if I'm going to be in it, I might just well, do as well as I can. So I went to Officers Candidate School and became an officer. And I initially had duty in Chicago after I got out of there, and after I got out of training. And then up at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, they asked if there were any volunteers to go up there to a radar site, and I volunteered. And but then I eventually ended up in Korea. And but the battle had just stopped, so I wasn't in any actual fighting. Let me tell you a little bit about my brother Jim. Mm-hmm. He was a year and a half younger than I was, and I really loved him. He was, and I respected him, and he was just a great guy. He was good looking and courageous. I remember in grammar school, I was having a fight with someone and wrestling around in the schoolyard, and all of a sudden I realized there was someone else in the fight too, and with my little brother Jim, who came along, and without any doubt or anything else, he jumped on to help his brother. But Jim was over in Korea at the same time I was, and we were drinking even before we went over there, but not too bad. But when Jim was over there, he was in trouble. People liked him, but he was drinking way too much and fighting. He was only a little guy, but